What if a nation never rose as an empire, never crowned a king, yet survived 1,000 years under foreign rule? Imagine a land where peasants spoke one tongue, nobles another, where cities rose in German style, laws were written in Latin, and songs were sung in Slovak. How could such a nation endure without losing its soul? The answers lie buried in centuries of silent defiance and fateful choices that shaped its destiny. Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, like it, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you. This is Slovakia, a country without Slovak kings, without grand castles or palaces as we know them. Its story is not one of royal triumphs, but of peasant communities, mountain villages, secret songs, and the relentless, almost invisible accumulation of cultural memory. How does a people remain themselves when every official voice speaks a foreign language? When the church preaches in Latin, courts sentence in German, and nobles declare themselves Hungarians? The answer unfolds in the shadows of history. Nestled at Europe's heart, Slovakia's geography is itself a story of isolation and survival. The Carpathian Mountains slice its lands north to south, carving out hidden valleys where ancient dialects and traditions flourished undisturbed. To the west lie plains blending into Moravia. To the south, the fertile Danube lowlands open wide. To the east, the towering, unforgiving Tatras. Rivers like Va, Hornad, and Poprad flow in all directions, shaping a land as fractured as its fate. But who lived here before the Slavs? Archaeologists uncovered traces of Celtic settlements, Roman fortifications along the Danube, and Germanic tribes. The 1st century marked the edge of the Roman Empire, the famous Danube limes, where legions built fortresses to repel northern barbarians. Merchants brought wine, olive oil, pottery, yet Rome never fully conquered these lands. When the empire fell, the Carpathians remained beyond its reach, a fortress of the unknown. Then came the Slavs, arriving in the 5th and 6th centuries from the east, settling lands emptied by the Great Migration. They were farmers and herders, living in tight-knit communities, building wooden homes, cultivating millet and rye, raising pigs and cows. Without writing or cities as Rome knew them, their power lay in family ties, rituals, and ancient customs. Burial rites, pottery styles, and unique adornments marked them apart from their Germanic and nomadic neighbors, silent testaments to an identity yet unbroken. In the 7th century, something extraordinary happened: the rise of the Samo realm. A Frankish merchant named Samo became the military leader of Slavic tribes united against the Avars, a nomadic people terrorizing all of Central Europe. The Avars demanded tribute, raided villages, and enslaved people. Yet Samo's leadership turned the tide. He forged a fragile confederation that resisted, forever changing the balance of power. This union lasted only about 40 years, but its memory echoed through the ages. Then came a second, more ambitious birth. In the 9th century, the great Moravian Empire emerged, a beacon of power and culture in a turbulent age. This was no mere alliance of tribes, but a state with vision. Yet its rise was shadowed by impossible choices and relentless pressure from neighboring forces. How would this fledgling power navigate the deadly politics of medieval Europe, caught between expanding empires and fierce rivalries? The fate of a people hung in the balance. The story of Slovakia is a story of impossible decisions made under crushing uncertainty. It is a tale of survival when every path led to risk, when every choice could erase a people's memory. A story where silence became resistance, where songs kept secrets, and where identity was forged in shadows. This history will challenge everything you think you know about survival, identity, and the price of remaining oneself against overwhelming odds. What if the very ground beneath your feet shifts forever? What happens when ancient powers collide and destinies are rewritten in blood and fire? In the heart of Central Europe, a mighty realm once controlled vast territories: modern Slovakia, the Czech Republic, parts of Hungary, Poland, and Austria. Its capital rested somewhere near the Morava River, a place still lost in the shadows of history, stirring fierce debates among scholars even today. But this was no ordinary kingdom. It was Great Moravia, and its fate would alter the course of nations. In the year 863, Prince Rostislav faced a critical choice: to preserve his people's identity or surrender to foreign dominance. He summoned from Byzantium two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, who would unleash a cultural revolution. They forged the Glagolitic script, the first written language for the Slavs, translating sacred texts into the vernacular. Suddenly, the Church spoke in the tongue of the people. For the first time, Slavs could read and write their own stories, their own prayers. A cultural explosion ignited, promising a new dawn. But this fragile flame would be snuffed out sooner than anyone imagined. By the dawn of the 10th century, a storm was gathering from the east. The Hungarian horsemen, fierce nomads from the Asian steppes, armed with powerful bows and relentless in their raids. In 906, they shattered Great Moravia's fragile heart, annihilating its political elite and scattering the survivors. The state vanished, swallowed by chaos and conquest. The Slav population remained, but their leaders were gone, exiled or killed. What remained was a void, soon filled by new rulers with a vastly different vision. The Hungarians carved out their dominion along the Danube lowlands, forging a kingdom under the iron will of their first crowned monarch, Stephen I, in the year 1000. Baptized and crowned by the Pope himself, Stephen began the painstaking construction of a centralized feudal state, solidifying his power through faith and force. This kingdom would grow swiftly, swallowing the lands of modern Slovakia and beyond, but the Hungarians were far from the majority. The north was home to Slavs, the west to Germans, the east to Romanians, the south to Croats and Serbs. A fragile mosaic of peoples held together by the dominance of Hungarian nobility. What does it mean to be conquered? In the Slovak lands, the shift was not marked by mass deportations or genocide. Instead, a silent overthrow of power occurred. Local Slovak princes either bowed to Hungarian kings or were replaced by new feudal lords. The peasants, unmoved by shifting crowns, continued their toil, plowing fields, raising livestock, paying taxes that now filled the coffers of foreign rulers. The soil remained the same, but the invisible chains tightened. A new order settled, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. The 11th and 12th centuries brought a deliberate strategy by Hungarian kings to settle and develop their northern lands. Skilled German colonists were invited, miners, craftsmen, and merchants who would found cities and breathe new life into the economy. Towns like Bratislava, then called Pressburg, Košice, Banska Štiavnica, and Bargiov, blossomed under German tongues and laws. German burghers ruled urban councils. Guild regulations were penned in their language. Meanwhile, Slovaks lingered mostly around villages, outsiders in their own cities. A complex social structure took form. Hungarian nobility held lands, German burghers controlled commerce, and Slovak peasants labored the fields. In this tripartite world of languages and cultures, Latin in churches, German in towns, Slovak in the countryside, tensions brewed beneath the surface. This was a world of coexistence shadowed by silent struggles, where identity was layered and survival depended on navigating unseen fault lines. The centuries to come would test these fragile balances in profound ways. The rich silver veins of Banska Štiavnica were a lifeline of wealth for the Hungarian kings. By the 13th century, elite miners from across Europe labored deep underground, engineering complex water drainage systems to keep the deadly shafts clear. Precious silver was smelted, coins minted, currency flowing across Europe's markets. The city expanded, erecting churches, town halls, and merchants' mansions. But beneath the prosperity lay a grim reality. Slovak miners toiled in darkness, facing cave-ins, floods, and suffocating air. Few lived beyond their 40s. There was no alternative. The land could not feed everyone, and the mines were the only hope for survival. As Hungary reached its zenith in the 13th century, the shadows of change crept closer. The mighty Habsburgs, devout Catholics, seized control and unleashed the Counter-Reformation, a fierce campaign to reclaim souls and power. Jesuits opened schools and universities, imposing new dogmas in a land already fractured by faith and culture. The choices made here were irreversible, the consequences rippling through centuries. Could ancient identities survive under the iron grip of a relentless crusade? The answer lay buried in the lives of those caught between faith, power, and survival. What happens when faith is outlawed and voices are silenced? When burning books and exile become the weapons of power? By the 17th century, Catholicism had clawed its way back to dominance after relentless persecution of Protestant preachers, driving their traditions into shadowy corners, remote villages and rugged mountains where hope barely flickered. But beneath this forced silence, a storm was gathering. The 17th century was a century of wars, bloody, unrelenting, shattering the continent. The 30 Years' War laid waste to Europe's heart. The Habsburgs clashed with Protestant forces, Turks and rebellious Hungarians. Slovak peasants bore the brutal brunt, relentless requisitions, looting, soldiers' violence. Armies swept through villages, seizing food, stealing livestock, burning homes to ash. The people's desperation ignited mass uprisings that threatened to overturn the old order. Among these upheavals, none was fiercer than the rebellion led by Imre Cele in the 1880s. A Hungarian nobleman, a Protestant, a fierce opponent of the Habsburgs, Cele promised freedom and rights to the oppressed Slovak peasants. They rallied behind him, driven by bitter years of suffering. But power's grip was merciless. The rebellion was crushed with savage force. Cele fled to the Turks, his dream seemingly shattered. In 1683, the very fate of Central Europe hung by a thread as the Ottomans besieged Vienna for 2 agonizing months. The city teetered on the brink of collapse, darkness closing in. Then salvation arrived. Polish King Jan Sobieski and his troops charged into battle. The Battle of Vienna was fierce, decisive. The Turks were shattered and scattered, marking a monumental turning point. The Ottoman Empire began its retreat, and the Habsburgs seized the momentum to reclaim lost land. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Habsburgs had reclaimed all of Hungary. The Turks were expelled, Buda restored as the capital, yet Bratislava held on to its importance as the coronation site, a symbol of shifting power. The 18th century brought fragile stability, but also ruthless feudal oppression. Landlords demanded ever more, 4 to 5 days of forced labor weekly from peasants, crushing taxes that deepened despair. The cracks in the system widened, threatening to burst. In 1667, the simmering tensions erupted into a massive revolt. Thousands of peasants, armed with pitchforks and scythes, surged toward the castles. They slaughtered stewards, torched archives, looted manor houses, an eruption of pent-up fury that shook eastern Slovakia to its core. The imperial response was brutal beyond measure. Armies crushed the uprising with blood and fire, executing hundreds, sending a chilling message. But even conquerors learned the old ways could no longer hold. Empress Maria Theresa, shaken by the uprising, enacted reforms that reluctantly curtailed forced labor and granted peasants limited rights. Schools opened, teaching children to read and write, a faint glimmer of progress. Yet these lessons came in German or Hungarian, while the Slovak language remained unspoken in education. The seeds of modernization were sown, but the soil was far from fertile for national identity. Across Europe, the winds of change blew fiercely in the late 18th century. The French Revolution of 1789 shattered old regimes with its thunderous cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Napoleon Bonaparte, the embodiment of upheaval, marched across the continent, leaving battle and transformation in his wake. Though Slovak lands escaped direct conflict, they felt the tremors. New taxes, recruitment demands, economic hardship that touched every hearth. Yet from the chaos emerged a spark of awakening: nationalism. Long-suppressed peoples stirred, questioning their identity beneath the shadow of sprawling empires. Czechs, Poles, Italians, Germans, all wrestled with their heritage and future. The Slovaks were no exception. Their renaissance hinged on the courage and vision of a few remarkable individuals who dared to dream of a unified nation. One such figure was Anton Bernalak, born in 1762 in a humble village. A Catholic priest by training, his passion transcended theology. Bernalak devoted himself to the Slovak language, recognizing its fragmented dialects and lack of written form as chains on his people's soul. He understood that without a common literary language, without grammar and dictionaries, the Slovak nation could never rise. His mission was both revolutionary and perilous, one that would shape a people's destiny. In 1787, Bernalak's vision was just beginning to take shape, while the continent roared with revolution, war, and the battle for identity. The stakes were immense. Would the Slovaks claim their voice before it was silenced forever? Or would they remain lost in the tides of empire and oppression? The choices made now were irreversible, the echoes of which would resonate through centuries. What happens when language becomes a battlefield? When the very words you speak threaten your identity and your future? In the early 19th century, a revolution was brewing in the heart of Europe, where the Slovak people faced an existential struggle over the soul of their nation. At the center was Anton Bernalak, who in the year 1785 published the very first Slovak grammar. But was this just the beginning of something greater, or the start of a deeper conflict? Bernalak chose the Western Slovak dialect spoken around Bratislava as the foundation for his grammar. He meticulously crafted rules of orthography and even created the first Slovak dictionary. This was no mere academic exercise. It was a seismic leap forward. For the first time, Slovak had a standardized written form. Yet, this victory ignited fierce debates and bitter disputes that would ripple through generations. Bernalak and his followers began translating religious texts, composing poems, and writing prose in the newly minted literary Slovak. Their cultural crusade was dubbed the Bernalak movement. But not everyone embraced this choice. Protestant communities, steeped in centuries of tradition, insisted that the Central Slovak dialects, closer to Czech, should form the basis instead. Why? Because the Czech language had long been the tongue of their worship. The memory of Great Moravia and the refuge it offered to the Czech brethren fleeing Catholic persecution still haunted their collective consciousness. Language was no mere tool. It was an emblem of identity, faith, and survival. These linguistic battles intertwined with a deeper struggle over national belonging. Across Europe, revolutionary tides were swelling. The Congress of Vienna, held in the years 1814 and 1815, restored old monarchies after Napoleon's fall. Yet the ideas of liberalism and nationalism surged relentlessly beneath the surface. In Hungary, the demand for autonomy grew louder, fueled by aristocrats and intellectual elites who dreamed of a Hungarian nation-state. But this dream came with a dark shadow, the ruthless policy of Magyarization. Hungarian language was imposed in schools, courts, and administration. Slovak schools shuttered. Priests were forbidden from preaching in Slovak. Publishing in Slovak fell under harsh restrictions. The Hungarian nationalists decreed that every subject of the kingdom must become Hungarian, sparking fierce resistance from the Slovak people. Amid the Western dialects were too distant from the speech of the majority. In 1843, Stur, alongside his comrades Josef Miloslav Herban and Michal Miloslav Hodja, forged a new literary language based on Central Slovak dialects. They created a grammar, an orthography, and a dictionary that resonated with most Slovaks. This was no small feat. It paved the way for the modern Slovak tongue. With their new language, Stur and his circle launched newspapers, penned articles on national history, culture, and Slovak rights. They organized cultural societies, collected folk songs, tales, and legends, sparking a romantic wave of nationalism. The belief that each nation possesses its unique spirit, mission, and culture fueled their every act. But Europe was on the brink of upheaval. The year 1848 exploded with revolutions. Paris toppled its king. Vienna was rocked by students and workers rising up. and in Budapest, the Hungarians declared independence from Austria. Seizing the moment, Stuart and his comrades drafted a powerful manifesto, the demands of the Slovak nation. They called for recognition of the Slovak language, the creation of Slovak schools, and Slovak participation in governance. Yet, even within the Slovak movement, tensions festered. The older generation, known as the Old Sturians, held conservative views. They placed their hopes on Russia, on Slavic unity, and on support from the Orthodox Empire. Their leader, Svetozar Hurban Vajansky, son of one of Stur's comrades, was a writer and publicist who wielded his pen as a weapon in this great ideological war. He penned novels steeped in national history, edited newspapers, and organized cultural initiatives. But as the flames of revolution spread, so did the uncertainty. Would the Slovak nation survive these fierce storms of language, identity, and power? Or would it be swallowed by the tides of history, forever lost to assimilation and silence? The fate of a people hung in the balance, shaped by choices that could never be undone. What happens when an entire people's identity teeters on the edge of extinction? Can cultural survival withstand the relentless tides of political oppression? The Slovaks faced this very crucible in the early 20th century, caught between fierce forces that threatened to swallow their heritage whole. The Hungarian government's policy of Magyarization clawed deep into Slovak lands, pushing a brutal campaign to assimilate them. Slovaks found themselves trapped in villages, bound to fields and mines, while Hungarian and German elites reaped the benefits of modernization. Budapest blossomed as one of Europe's grandest cities, yet its glow cast a harsh shadow over Slovak realities, where education was a rare luxury and literacy barely reached half the population by 1910. Amid this bleak landscape, sparks of resistance kindled. Socialist voices rose, linking the fight for national rights with the demand for social justice. Slovak workers and peasants began organizing strikes and unions, risking imprisonment and exile under the Hungarian authorities' brutal crackdown. A storm was gathering, but its fury would soon collide with an even greater upheaval. Meanwhile, a different vision divided the Slovak intelligentsia. Some saw salvation through unity with the Czechs, an industrially and culturally advanced people living in Bohemia and Moravia, with political representation at Vienna's parliament. This ideology of Czechoslovakism promised strength and alliance, yet it sowed fierce debate. Would joining the Czechs mean losing Slovak sovereignty? Or was independence within Hungary the only path forward? These disputes cut to the heart of identity and survival. To some, Slovaks were a distinct nation with their own language and history, deserving an independent state. To others, assimilation was a bitter but necessary compromise for individual advancement, and a slow erasure of a people's soul. The stakes were immense, and the arguments bitter and unyielding. Despite these struggles, Hungary surged ahead with modernization, railways, industry, and expanding cities transforming the landscape. Yet the fruits of progress remained stubbornly out of reach for Slovaks. The official culture, education, and public life centered on the Hungarian language. Slovak was banished to the countryside, a tongue of poverty and invisibility. Many Slovaks, craving social mobility, abandoned their own names and language, slipping quietly into the Hungarian identity. Each choice felt like a step toward oblivion. In the midst of this cultural siege, pockets of resistance flickered like beacons. The Slovak National Society, Matica Slovenska, operated in the shadows, publishing books, preserving folklore, and staging literary evenings in Martin, a small town in central Slovakia. Writers like Pavel Arsag and Gwozdowski wove poetry that celebrated the rugged beauty of their homeland and the hardships of peasant life, infusing their verses with fierce pride and longing. At the same time, Martin Kukuchin chronicled the harsh realities of Slovak immigrants and social struggles in his realistic stories, while Josef Gregor-Tajovsky brought Slovak life to the stage through amateur theater. Yet all this cultural expression existed on the fringes, overshadowed by the dominant Hungarian narrative. The battle for Slovak identity was fought in whispers and secret gatherings, risking extinction with every act of defiance. As the 20th century dawned, it seemed the Slovak nation's fate was sealed. Magyarization appeared invincible, destined to dissolve Slovaks into the Hungarian majority within 2 or 3 generations. But history would deal a different, cruel hand, one that would shatter empires and redraw borders with brutal finality. In 1914, a single gunshot in Sarajevo ignited a global catastrophe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand unleashed the First World War, pitting empires against each other in a deadly spiral. Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia defended Serbia. Germany backed Austro-Hungary. France and Britain joined Russia. The old world bled and crumbled. Millions perished, and the Slovak peasants were conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, marching into a war that would decide their nation's fate forever. What drives a nation to fight on multiple fronts, against enemies old and new? How do thousands lose their lives in distant trenches, swallowed by hunger and disease? Against the backdrop of World War I, Slovak soldiers were scattered, fighting Russians in the Carpathians, Italians in Italy, Serbs in the Balkans. Thousands perished, some taken prisoner. Among those captured by the Russians were tens of thousands of Slovak soldiers, forced into captivity alongside Czech prisoners. This grim encounter sparked the birth of something unprecedented: the Czechoslovak legions, fighting for the Entente against the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire. But this was only the beginning of an irreversible chain of decisions fueled by fear and hope. Who dares to dream of a nation born from the ruins of a crumbling empire? In exile, Czech and Slovak politicians seized the war's chaos as a chance to claim their independence. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, a philosopher and politician, forged the Czechoslovak National Council, rallying Western allies to dismantle Austro-Hungary and replace it with new national states. By his side stood Milan Rostislav Štefanik, born in 1888, an astronomer turned pilot and diplomat who risked everything flying combat missions in the French Air Force before plunging into political warfare. Stefanik's tireless efforts to organize the legions across France, Russia, and Italy and negotiate with the French and British governments set the stage for an independent future. The stakes could not have been higher. What happens when an empire collapses under the weight of its own contradictions? In 1918, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy shattered. Its army dissolved, the economy ground to a halt. National uprisings exploded. Emperor Karl I's desperate attempt to salvage his empire through federalization failed. On October 28th, the National Committee in Prague declared the independence of Czechoslovakia. 2 days later, Slovak leaders in Martin signed a declaration aligning Slovakia with the newborn state. It was a moment of triumph and the birth of a profoundly complex new reality. Two kindred yet distinct peoples united under one flag. Who would wield the power in this fragile union? Tomáš Masaryk became the first president, Prague the capital. Slovakia was granted autonomy, at least on paper. Yet reality proved far more complicated. The Czechs, more industrialized and politically experienced, dominated the new state. Slovakia lacked a developed intelligentsia, administrative structures, and governance experience. Thousands of Czech officials, teachers, and policemen flooded into Slovakia, taking key positions. They built schools, courts, roads, introduced modern laws and institutions. For Slovaks, this duality was a bitter paradox, an opportunity for cultural growth shadowed by an uneasy loss of control. The tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. How do you forge a single nation from two diverse identities? Czech officials spoke of a unified Czechoslovak nation, a single people. Slovak nationalists rejected this, insisting on the distinctiveness of their culture and demanding true autonomy. The political struggle was fierce. In the 1920s, Czechoslovakia was one of Europe's most democratic and prosperous countries. Parliaments functioned, elections were free, courts independent. The economy thrived. Czech industries produced weapons, automobiles, textiles. New factories, schools, and roads emerged in Slovakia, raising living standards. Yet the fault lines deepened. The Slovak People's Party, led by charismatic Catholic priest Andrej Hlinka, pressed relentlessly for Slovak self-rule, embodying the growing conflict between unity and division. What price does a nation pay when internal strife meets external war? As Europe plunged once again into chaos, Slovakia found itself entangled in the machinery of German war efforts. Raw materials and food supplies were funneled to fuel the Nazi war machine. The Slovak army took part in invasions of Poland and the Soviet Union. The regime, known as TISOs, rose amid this deadly alliance. Every choice, every alliance, every battle sealed the fate of millions. Decisions driven by fear, ambition, and survival. The echoes of these irreversible choices would resonate far beyond the battlefields, shaping destiny in ways no one could have foreseen. What happens when fear and power collide? When a nation's soul is torn between collaboration and resistance? Joseph Tiso, a man hailed by some as a hero, condemned by others as a traitor, how did his choices shape Slovakia's darkest hours? The rise of an authoritarian clerical regime gripped Slovakia, where the Catholic Church wielded immense influence, and all other political parties were banned. Censorship tightened its grip, silencing dissent. And then came the unthinkable, the systematic persecution of Jews. Slovakia enacted racial laws that stripped Jewish citizens of their rights, a grim prelude to mass deportations. Thousands of Slovak Jews were sent to concentration camps, most never to return. This was the Slovak Holocaust, a tragic chapter shrouded in silence for decades. Yet, amid the darkness, sparks of defiance ignited. Underground communist and democratic groups began plotting rebellion, forging secret ties with the Czechoslovak government in exile in London, and receiving aid from Soviet partisans. August 1944 marked the eruption of the Slovak national uprising. The city of Banská Bystrica in central Slovakia became the epicenter of revolt. Rebels seized control, boldly proclaiming the restoration of Czechoslovakia. Around 60,000 fighters, soldiers, partisans, civilians, joined the cause. They established provisional authorities, published newspapers, and issued calls to arms. Allied forces dropped weapons and supplies, fueling hope against overwhelming odds. But the Nazi response was swift and brutal. SS troops poured into Slovakia, unleashing a merciless campaign to crush the uprising. Fierce battles raged for 2 relentless months. Towns and villages were razed to the ground. Thousands perished, executed or sent to camps. By late October, the rebellion was extinguished, but its flame endured as a symbol of resistance and national pride. In the aftermath, the communist regime seized the narrative, transforming the uprising into an official myth. August 29th became a national holiday, a day to remember sacrifice and defiance. Meanwhile, the Red Army advanced into Slovakia in spring 1945, driving out German forces. The Slovak Republic collapsed. Joseph Tiso fled, only to be captured, tried for treason and collaboration, and executed in 1947. His legacy remains a bitter divide: patriot or collaborator. The war's end reshaped Czechoslovakia irrevocably. The Sudeten Germans were expelled, displacing 3 million people in a sweeping act of ethnic cleansing sanctioned by the Allies. Hungary's minority in southern Slovakia faced repression, deportation, and forced assimilation. The scars of these irreversible choices carved deep wounds into the nation's fabric. February 1948 saw the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. President Edvard Beneš resigned and died months later, while Klement Gottwald rose to power, imposing a Soviet-style totalitarian regime. Nationalization, collectivization, and political purges followed swiftly. Thousands were arrested, hundreds executed. The church, once a pillar of Slovak society, was persecuted. Monasteries shuttered, priests imprisoned. Slovakia became a nominal republic within a federal state, but real power lay in Prague's Central Committee. Industrialization surged. Massive factories, power plants, and chemical complexes transformed the landscape. Peasants abandoned their farms for factory work, as the old rural way of life crumbled under the relentless march of urbanization. Socialist culture took root, demanding artists and writers glorify the party, the working class, and the communist future. Dissent was crushed without mercy. Yet even under this oppressive shadow, Slovak culture found ways to flourish. Theaters opened, libraries expanded, museums preserved history. For the first time, the Slovak language became the official medium of education, science, and administration, building a national infrastructure within the confines of communism. Each decision, each act of repression or resistance echoed through generations. The choices made in those turbulent years, by leaders, by ordinary people, shaped a nation's destiny. What price was paid for survival? And what ghosts still haunt the land where history's irreversible currents continue to flow. What drives a nation into the grip of terror? How far will a regime go to silence its own people? In the 50s, brutal repression swept through Czechoslovakia like a dark storm. Show trials targeted enemies of the state, bourgeois nationalists, spies of imperialism. Thousands were thrown into prisons. Among them, prominent Slovak communists who had fallen out of favor with Moscow or Prague's leadership. Vladimir Klementis, the foreign minister and a leading Slovak communist, was arrested, condemned in a fabricated trial, and hanged in 1952. This was the apex of Stalin's terror, a ruthless purge that crushed dissent and sowed fear. Yet after Stalin's death in 1953, a faint glimmer of relief emerged, some easing of the iron grip, but the system remained unforgiving, unyielding. The 60s brought a restless yearning for change. Intellectuals, writers, and students in Czechoslovakia began to demand freedom of speech, democratization, and a socialism with a human face. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček, a Slovak reformer and liberalizer, rose to power. The Prague Spring had begun. Censorship was lifted. Independent organizations were allowed. Political reforms openly discussed. Hope and enthusiasm filled the air. But Moscow's alarm bells rang loud and clear. Brezhnev and Soviet leaders feared losing control, feared Czechoslovakia slipping from the socialist camp. On August 21, 1968, Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia. Tanks rolled into the streets of Prague. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers flooded the country. The people responded with peaceful defiance, protests, street confrontations, slogans scrawled on walls. No armed uprising, only courage in the face of overwhelming force. Dubček was arrested, taken to Moscow, forced to sign a surrender. The reforms were crushed. Normalization began, a return to harsh rule. Thousands lost jobs, fled abroad, or were imprisoned. 2 decades of stagnation followed. The economy faltered, and life became a dull, gray existence, devoid of freedom or hope. Yet beneath the surface, a dissident movement took root. In the Czech lands, Charter 77 emerged, signed by intellectuals including future President Václav Havel. Slovakia, more conservative and loyal to the regime, harbored fewer dissenters. Then came 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, ushering in perestroika, openness, democratization, economic reforms. A wave of change swept across the socialist bloc. Poland's solidarity triumphed. Hungary reformed. The Berlin Wall fell in East Germany. In November 1989, the Velvet Revolution erupted in Czechoslovakia. Students marched in Prague, met with brutal police crackdowns. Outrage ignited the nation. The next day, hundreds of thousands flooded the streets. Keys jingled, a symbol that the communist era was ending, that it was time to leave. The regime hesitated to use force. Communist leaders resigned. Dissidents took power. Václav Havel became president. A peaceful, bloodless revolution, the Velvet Revolution, had succeeded. But beneath the triumph, tensions simmered between Czechs and Slovaks. Czechs pushed for rapid market reforms and Western integration. Slovaks feared factory closures, unemployment, and poverty. Slovak politicians demanded special treatment, greater autonomy, and protection for local industry. The disputes grew sharper, more volatile. In 1992, Vladimir Mešar, a charismatic populist, rose to power in Slovakia. Playing on national sentiments, he challenged the fragile unity of the nation. His tenure was marked by controversy and conflict, culminating in his forced resignation. This moment marked a turning point. A new generation of Slovaks emerged, young, educated, and pro-European, ready to claim their future. But the choices made in those turbulent years would echo for decades, shaping the fate of a nation caught between past shadows and uncertain horizons. What does it truly mean to survive as a nation caught between empires and ideologies? How do choices made under pressure echo through centuries? Slovakia's story begins not with conquest or glory, but with endurance. A small Slavic people overshadowed and silenced for 1,000 years. Yet from the depths of obscurity, a nation was forged. But could the flicker of identity withstand the crushing weight of history? For centuries, the Slovaks lived under Hungarian rule, denied their own state, their elite, even their language. Called a people without history, their narrative was erased by victors, Hungarian kings, Austrian emperors. Still, the Slovak spirit clung fiercely to its language and culture, a secret rebellion sung in songs and whispered in prayers. How does a people create history when history refuses to record them? This question shadowed their every step toward self-definition. The 19th century sparked a national awakening. Figures like Ludovic Stur and Josef Miloslav Hurban emerged, visionaries who dared to craft a Slovak literary language and a national consciousness. They faced impossible odds, fighting against assimilation and neglect. Their triumph was no mere cultural victory, it was a defiant claim to identity. But could this fragile seed of nationhood survive the brutal upheavals looming ahead? The 20th century brought both hope and catastrophe. Slovakia found itself within Czechoslovakia, navigating a complex national identity within a new state. Yet the shadow of dark compromises loomed. The Slovak Republic under Josef Tiso betrayed its people by collaborating with Nazism and participating in the Holocaust. This tragic stain forced a reckoning. How could a nation claim freedom when its leaders chose complicity over courage? Then came decades under the communist regime, an iron grip that crushed political freedom, but paradoxically built modern industry and education. The regime's cold hand shaped Slovakia's infrastructure, but silenced dissent and warped truth. Could progress born of oppression ever be truly free? These contradictions tore at the nation's soul, setting the stage for a volatile future. In 2004, a historic milestone, the election of Zuzana Čaputová, Slovakia's first woman president and a liberal lawyer and activist. Her victory was a beacon for change, a symbol of a new era. Yet even as hope swelled, the nation was riven. Conservative, nationalist, and Eurosceptic forces held strong, especially in rural and eastern regions. The battle for Slovakia's soul was far from over. Populist parties gained momentum, fueling fierce debates over European integration, migration, LGBT rights, and relations with Russia. Slovakia stood at a crossroads, torn between the liberal West and the conservative East. Each choice carried monumental consequences, threatening to fracture a society already burdened by its layered history. How does a nation reconcile its past with its future? The tension was palpable. The scars of history run deep. The legacy of Tiso's regime, the communist yoke, the unresolved grievances between Slovaks and the Hungarian minority in southern Slovakia. 1,000 years of Hungarian influence permeate architecture, cuisine, and traditions. Yet the relationship remains fraught between shared history and painful memories of oppression. These wounds challenge the very notion of Slovak identity. Who are the Slovaks? A small Slavic people who almost lost their language, forged into a nation by the relentless efforts of passionate visionaries in the 19th century. Their state was born not from conquest, but from the chaos of world wars and geopolitical upheavals, a fragile construct balanced on a razor's edge. Their history is not one of empires or colonies, but of survival, adaptation, and unwavering perseverance. It is the story of peasants singing in their tongue while their lords spoke Hungarian, of priests and teachers gathering folklore and codifying grammar, of workers and intellectuals fighting for national rights, of ordinary people yearning to live in their own country, to raise their children in their culture. These silent struggles built the foundation of a nation that still questions whether its fate is self-determined or dictated by forces beyond control. Today, Slovakia stands as a modern European state with 5.5 million people, a member of the European Union, NATO, and the Eurozone. Bratislava pulses as a dynamic city. The Tatras draw tourists worldwide. Slovak hockey players win championships. Its artists resonate beyond borders. But beneath this vibrant facade lies a nation haunted by its past and wrestling with the irreversible choices that shaped its destiny. Every debate over Tiso's legacy, every argument about the communist era, every conflict over minority rights is not just political. It is a confrontation with identity itself. Slovakia's history is a chain of fateful decisions, each with consequences that ripple into the present. The question remains, will this resilient people continue to navigate their complex heritage with courage, or will history's shadows dictate their future? What does it mean to be a nation? To hold a language that is more than just words, a living, breathing identity. The Slovaks were convinced, piece by piece, that they were a distinct people with the undeniable right to self-determination. This was no mere cultural shift. It was a revolution in the very soul of a people, reshaping the course of history itself. Yet this awakening was only the beginning of a much darker story. From 1918 until 1993, Czechoslovakia pulsed with the energy of modernization. Slovakia transformed rapidly from a backwater, agrarian periphery into an industrial society. A Slovak intelligentsia emerged. Science, art, and thought flourished. But beneath this progress lurked a bitter truth. Slovaks often felt like junior partners in a union dominated by the Czechs. This simmering resentment would soon ignite with devastating consequences. Tensions mounted quietly beneath the political surface until they could no longer be contained. The uneasy partnership fractured, driven by years of frustration and inequality. In 1993, what seemed impossible became reality. A peaceful split that birthed an independent Slovak state. This was no violent revolution. It was a fragile act of negotiation and compromise. Yet its reverberations were irreversible. Slovak independence came almost by accident, a byproduct of Czechoslovakia's collapse. But this accidental sovereignty demanded a choice: to squander this new freedom or to seize it and build something enduring. The Slovaks chose resilience. They crafted a viable state from the rubble of uncertain beginnings, stepping into the unknown with both hope and trepidation. Today, Slovakia stands at a crossroads familiar to many small European nations. How do you preserve your identity in a world that relentlessly pushes for globalization? How do you balance national pride with the demands of European integration? These are not just political questions. They cut deep into the fears and hopes of every citizen, and the answers remain perilously out of reach. Slovakia wrestles with the shadows of corruption, the rise of populism, and the crushing weight of social inequality. It exists in the uneasy company of larger neighbors, Czechia, Austria, Hungary, Poland, each with their own ambitions and histories. How do you maintain independence when surrounded by giants? This question gnaws at Slovakia's very core, threatening to unravel everything the nation has fought so hard to achieve. At the heart of Slovak identity beats its language, a Slavic tongue close to Czech, yet uniquely its own, with distinct cadences and expressions. The Slovak language is not just communication, it is a fortress of culture, a battleground where identity is fiercely defended. But as the world changes, can this linguistic heritage survive the relentless tide of homogenization? The stakes have never been higher. Beyond words, Slovak culture breathes through its literature. From the stirring romantic poems of Pavel Orszag Hviezdoslav to the bold narratives of contemporary writers, music carries the echoes of folk traditions while embracing modern rhythms. Even Slovak cinema, once obscure, now claims trophies on international stages, signaling a culture both rooted and evolving. But behind every success lies the fragile question: how long can this cultural mosaic hold together? Slovak cuisine tells its own story, a reflection of geography and history intertwined. Hungarian, Austrian, and Polish influences simmer in dishes like brędzowe haluszki, the iconic potato dumplings with sheep's cheese that define national taste. Kapustnica, a sour cabbage soup with meat, warms the heart through harsh winters. Trdelnik, the sweet, spiraled pastry, draws tourists but also evokes tradition. And beneath it all, the fiery spirit of slivovica, a plum brandy, reminds Slovaks of their shared Slavic roots. But behind these flavors lies the constant tension between preservation and change. Nature itself is a stage for Slovakia's drama. The high Tatras rise like jagged sentinels, luring climbers and skiers to risk everything for glory. The Slovak Paradise National Park hides deep gorges, waterfalls, and caves, some honored as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Castles perch perilously on cliffs: Spiš Castle, Devin, Trencin, monuments to a turbulent past. Wooden churches in the Carpathians stand as silent witnesses to centuries of faith and struggle. Slovakia is a land of contrasts, where ancient and modern collide in a constant battle for survival. This battle plays out every day in Bratislava's streets, where skyscrapers and multinational corporations tower over a city still wrestling with its past. Far from urban bustle, mountain villages linger in time, their inhabitants living much as they did a century ago. The youth study abroad, speak multiple languages, and dream cosmopolitan dreams. Meanwhile, conservative rural communities cling fiercely to their traditions, unwilling to let go. The collision of these worlds shapes Slovakia's present and its uncertain future. A silent crisis looms, an aging society with declining birth rates. Young people flee westward to Austria, Germany, the United Kingdom in search of better lives. This exodus drains Slovakia's vitality, a common story across Eastern Europe. Yet a faint reversal appears as some return, bearing new skills and perspectives. Slovak startups rise in IT fields. Bratislava emerges as a hub of innovation. But the question remains, can Slovakia sustain this fragile revival, or will it become a ghost of its former self? Relations with neighbors are a complicated dance, a tangled mix of brotherhood and rivalry. With the Czechs, the bond is intimate yet strained. Many Czechs still see Slovaks as younger siblings, while Slovaks harbor envy over Czech economic success and cultural dominance. Yet, despite this friction, mutual understanding requires no interpreter. The shared language and history bind them in an uneasy but undeniable connection. This delicate balance could either stabilize the region or shatter under the weight of old grudges and new ambitions. Cultural exchange flows relentlessly across borders. Ideas, art, and traditions intertwine in a vibrant tapestry. But beneath this surface lies an enduring question. Can Slovakia maintain its unique identity without becoming simply a reflection of its neighbors? The fate of this small nation hinges on the choices made in the shadows, the irreversible decisions born of fear, hope, and the relentless march of history. What will be the cost of survival, and who will pay it? What if the very fabric of a nation's identity hinged on impossible choices? How does a people survive centuries under foreign rule without losing themselves? And when the moment of reckoning comes, what price will they pay for freedom? Slovakia's story is a tale of relentless struggle, painful compromises, and hopes that refuse to die. But the future remains uncertain, and the clock is ticking. For over 1,000 years, Slovakia was trapped within the vast Hungarian Empire. This 1,000-year shadow shaped its language, economy, and culture, a complex legacy neither curse nor gift. The Slovaks were not Hungarians, but their identity was forged under that weight, quietly sleeping beneath the surface, waiting to awaken. Could a fragmented nation reclaim itself, or would it remain lost in history's tides? The Slovak national revival was no grand uprising, but a fragile spark ignited by a handful of passionate visionaries. Against overwhelming odds, they nurtured language, culture, and memory, the lifeblood of a suppressed people. This was a choice: to remember, to resist, to dream of self-determination. But could that spark survive the harsh winds of empire and indifference? The path to independence was a treacherous, winding road. From great Moravia's ancient glory to the birth of the modern Slovak Republic, centuries of triumph and tragedy, betrayal and resilience marked every step. The stakes rose with each passing era. Could Slovakia claim its place on the map, or be swallowed in the shadows yet again? The answer was far from certain. Today, Slovakia faces fresh and fierce challenges. Globalization, climate change, migration, and political turmoil threaten the country's fragile stability. The environment is under siege. Choking air in cities, vanishing forests, disappearing wildlife. Agriculture suffers. The clock is relentless. Will political will and investment rise to meet the urgent call for green energy and sustainable development? Or will these crises spiral beyond control? Beneath the surface of politics and policy, a deeper fault line divides Slovak society. A clash of visions. A liberal Europe embracing human rights, tolerance, and openness, versus a conservative fortress clinging to tradition, faith, and sovereignty. These opposing worlds collide violently in elections and public discourse. Can such fractures heal, or will the nation's future be torn apart by irreconcilable fears? Discrimination cuts deep, especially against the Roma minority. Accused of crime and exclusion, they suffer systemic neglect and social isolation. This is not mere prejudice. It is a root problem embedded in the structures of society, fueling poverty and despair. Can Slovakia break free from this vicious cycle, or will these divisions fester, poisoning the country's soul? Yet, amidst struggle, Slovakia's cultural heart beats strong. Theaters echo with timeless classics and daring new voices. Philharmonic orchestras soar. Galleries display the works of Slovak and international artists alike. Literary festivals draw global minds. Film festivals showcase bold, independent cinema. For a small country, Slovakia's cultural stage is vibrant, alive, and fiercely proud. But can art alone heal a nation divided? Education remains a fragile beacon of hope. Universities in Bratislava, Košice, and beyond prepare the next generation, many gaining experience abroad through Erasmus and other programs. They return carrying knowledge and connections vital for change. Yet the system groans under pressure. Rural schools shudder, teacher salaries stagnate, and quality varies wildly. Without reform, who will lead Slovakia forward? The Catholic Church holds profound sway in Slovak society. Most Slovaks identify as Catholic, and the Church's voice shapes debates on abortion, euthanasia, and LGBT rights. Conservative values stand firm, yet secularism creeps in, especially among youth. The Church's influence wanes with each passing generation, mirroring a broader European shift. What will remain of tradition when faith fades? This is Slovakia at a crossroads. Will it embrace a future rooted in European liberalism, open, inclusive, and rights-focused? Or will it retreat into a conservative holdout, guarding national identity and sovereignty with iron resolve? The choices are stark and the stakes immense. The nation's soul trembles on the edge of irreversible decisions. History teaches us that survival favors not the strongest, but the most adaptable. Slovaks have endured centuries of foreign domination by Hungarians, Austrians, Germans, yet their identity survived, evolving but unbroken. They carry scars and stories, but also resilience and hope. The future is theirs to shape, but only if they dare to decide. Will Slovakia find unity amid division? Can corruption be rooted out? Will common purpose overcome fear and suspicion? The nation's fate hinges on these choices, a delicate balance between past and future, tradition and progress. The clock ticks, and history watches. The question remains, what will Slovakia become? What does it really take to preserve a people against the tide of time? How do you safeguard a language, a culture, and an identity when the world around you is desperate to erase them? The Slovak communists faced this brutal question head-on, clinging to their heritage amidst chaos. But survival was only the beginning. They did more than just survive. They built a nation from the ashes of conflict and doubt. A fragile state emerged, stitched together by the will of those who dared to dream. Yet standing on that precipice brought a terrifying truth. The struggle to stay intact had only just begun. What price would they pay to solidify their hard-won independence? Now the challenge was clear: to make Slovakia not a fleeting shadow in history, but an enduring force, one that future generations would wear like armor, proud and unbreakable. Every decision from this moment on bore the weight of irreversible consequence. Could they fortify their young state, or would it crumble under pressure? The stakes were never higher. Would the sacrifices of the past become a foundation or a tomb? The haunting fear lingered. What if all this was just a momentary flicker, an accident of history? The answer demanded relentless resolve, yet the path was fraught with peril. Independence is not a gift. It is a choice made again and again, each time with new dangers lurking, each choice echoing into eternity. The story of Slovakia's future was no longer just about survival, but about forging an identity that would withstand every storm. Would they succeed, or would the shadows reclaim their legacy? What comes next is not merely history. It is a living testament to human fear, ambition, and the consequences of decisions that can never be undone. Join us as we unravel the layers of this fragile journey and consider the weight of choices that define nations. Your voice matters too. Share the stories you want to hear. Subscribe to this channel and like the video to become part of the conversation shaping history's next chapter. The future of Slovakia depends on the stories we dare to tell.